The wind howled through the towering skyscrapers of Chicago, carrying with it a sharp chill that pierced the air. Vince Moretti, a young security officer at the prestigious Chicago Art Museum, stepped out into the early morning hours after another long shift. His mind was tired, but his body remained alert, trained to be vigilant, to watch over the exhibits, and to ensure everything was in order. But as he walked toward the parking lot, he noticed something strange. A scream. It wasn't a regular scream. This one was filled with panic, a cry for help. Without hesitation, Vince sprinted toward the sound, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls that lined the streets near Lake Michigan. As he approached, he saw a figure struggling in the freezing water, a little girl, no more than 8 years old, flailing helplessly in the waves. The water was cold, the lake unrelenting, and the air bitter. No one seemed to be moving to help her. People stood frozen at the shore, too afraid or too hesitant to act. But Vince didn't hesitate. He had been a strong swimmer since childhood. With no time to think, he dove into the freezing depths of the lake, his body cutting through the water with determination. The current was strong, but Vince's will was stronger. He swam through the dark, murky water, each stroke more exhausting than the last, until he reached the little girl. She was barely conscious, her small body shivering and limp in his arms. With all his strength, Vince hauled her to the shore, gasping for breath himself. As he performed CPR, he could feel the weight of the moment settling in. He wasn't just saving a child's life, he had stepped into a dangerous world without knowing it. The girl's breathing returned to normal, but Vince could not shake the feeling that something was about to change. The little girl, her face pale and wet, looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes. "Are you okay?" Vince asked, his voice trembling slightly from the cold. She nodded, but her fear remained etched on her face. The sound of sirens in the distance reminded Vince that he had done what was needed. He had saved her life. But as the first responders arrived, one thing about this rescue became apparent. The girl he had saved, who introduced herself as Lily, was no ordinary child. She was the daughter of Victor Ricci, a man whose name was feared in Chicago's underworld. Victor Ricci was a man who had power and influence that reached into the darkest corners of the city. His reputation for cruelty and control over the criminal elite made him untouchable. And now, his daughter owed her life to a man who didn't even know who he was saving. As the police questioned witnesses and began their investigation, Vince felt the weight of the situation. His name was now tied to one of the most powerful and dangerous figures in Chicago, and Vince's life, which had once been ordinary, would never be the same again. Victor Ricci, although not immediately visible, began to make his presence felt. Rumors swirled about his intentions, and Vince was soon aware of the constant surveillance he was under. Black SUVs, darkened windows, and men in suits who watched him from afar. Vince couldn't shake the feeling that his every move was being tracked. The next few days were a blur for Vince. Despite his best efforts to continue his routine, he couldn't ignore the growing tension. He was just a security guard, an ordinary man, yet somehow he had become part of something far more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. Vince's life had always been quiet, filled with the humdrum of security shifts, late-night patrols, and the occasional visit to a local bar after work. But since saving Lily, everything had changed. It wasn't just the increased police presence, or the hushed whispers when people saw him on the street. It was the feeling that something dark was watching, waiting, just beyond his reach. One evening, after another grueling shift at the museum, Vince made his way to his car, his breath visible in the cold night air. He was exhausted, mentally and physically, but as he reached for the door handle of his car, he froze. A figure stood in the shadows across the parking lot, tall, broad-shouldered, and undeniably commanding. Vince instinctively tensed, his hands slowly moving toward the keys in his pocket. "Vince Moretti," a deep, gravelly voice called out. Vince turned slowly. The man who stepped out of the shadows wasn't just anyone. It was Victor Ricci. Victor Ricci was a legend in Chicago's criminal circles. A man whose reputation was built on ruthlessness and control. His very presence radiated power and danger, and for a moment, Vince could only stare. There was no denying the force of Victor's gaze, The way his piercing eyes seemed to cut through Vince as if reading him like a book. "I wanted to thank you," Victor said, his voice low, but not without a strange warmth. "For saving my daughter's life." Vince nodded slowly, unsure of how to respond. "It was nothing. Just doing what anyone would do." Victor stepped closer, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the pavement with every step. "You're wrong," he said, his tone soft but firm. "Not everyone would do what you did. And for that, I owe you." Vince's heart raced. He knew who Victor Ricci was. Everyone did. And yet, here he was, standing in front of him, speaking as though they were old acquaintances. The world Vince had always known seemed to be crumbling around him, his ordinary life turning into something unrecognizable. "I'd like to talk to you," Victor continued, his eyes locking onto Vince's. "About what happens next." Victor didn't give Vince a chance to respond. He simply turned on his heel and walked toward an imposing black car parked nearby. The driver, a stoic figure in a black suit, opened the door for Vince, but he hesitated. Vince wasn't stupid. He knew this wasn't just a casual conversation. This was Victor Ricci offering him something. What, exactly, Vince wasn't sure, but it felt like an offer he couldn't refuse. Against his better judgment, Vince got into the car. As the vehicle pulled away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. The car ride was quiet, the only sound being the hum of the engine as it moved smoothly through the streets of Chicago. Vince glanced at Victor from time to time, trying to make sense of the situation. Was he about to be dragged into something he couldn't escape? Or was this merely an expression of gratitude from a powerful man who now owed him a favor? The car eventually stopped in front of an elegant, upscale restaurant on the outskirts of the city. The place was secluded, tucked away in a corner of Chicago's elite district. It was the kind of restaurant that didn't need a sign to attract attention. The patrons knew where to find it. Victor led Vince inside, where they were quickly seated in a private booth, away from the prying eyes of the public. The room was dimly lit, its atmosphere a mix of old-world charm and modern luxury. Vince felt out of place here, like he was walking in someone else's shoes, and it made him uncomfortable. "Relax," Victor said, noticing Vince's tense posture. "I'm not here to make you uncomfortable. I just want to have a conversation. Man to man." Victor leaned forward, his expression serious. "You've done something no one else in my world would do. You've saved my daughter. And for that, you've earned my respect. But this is about more than gratitude. You've now seen a side of Chicago that most people don't even know exists. And that comes with a price." Vince's stomach tightened. This was the part he feared, the part where he would be pulled deeper into Victor's world. Victor continued, his voice even but laced with an undeniable sense of authority. "I want to offer you something, Vince. I want to offer you protection. In my world, protection is everything. It's a currency. And I can make sure you never have to worry about anything, about your family, your safety, your future. But in return, you'll owe me. And that debt will be paid, sooner or later. It's the way things work." Vince felt his heart race. The offer was tempting, but it came with strings attached. The kind of strings that could tie him down in ways he couldn't imagine. Yet, at the same time, the alternative was equally frightening. To refuse Victor was to risk something far worse. Victor leaned back, studying Vince's face carefully, almost as if waiting for a reaction. "So, what will it be? Protection and power, or anonymity and risk?" Vince knew that the decision he was about to make would change everything. There was no going back after this. The silence between Vince and Victor seemed to stretch for an eternity, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a heavy cloak. Vince's mind raced, 1,000 thoughts flashing through his head. He thought of his family, his life, and the future that lay ahead. If he accepted Victor's offer, he would step into a world where nothing was certain, a world governed by power and fear. But if he turned it down, he might find himself on the wrong side of that same power, left exposed and vulnerable. Victor, sensing the tension, remained calm, his gaze never leaving Vince. "Take your time," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "You're not the first man to face a choice like this. And you won't be the last." Vince could feel the weight of his words. It wasn't just a choice between safety and danger, it was a choice between the life he knew and a life he couldn't even begin to comprehend. Finally, Vince spoke, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of uncertainty. "What exactly are you asking of me?" Victor leaned forward, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "All I'm asking is that you accept the protection I offer. You'll be part of something bigger, something far more influential than anything you've ever known. In return, you'll do what I need when the time comes. You won't be expected to do anything that goes against your morals, but you'll be expected to stand by me when I call." Vince took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle in. It was clear that this wasn't a simple favor. Accepting this protection meant becoming a part of Victor's world, whether he liked it or not. And that world, as Vince had already seen, was dark, violent, and unpredictable. "I don't know if I can be part of that," Vince said slowly. "I'm just a guy. A security guard. I've never wanted anything more than a simple life." Victor smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "You may be just a guy now, Vince. But in this world, that's exactly why you're useful. People like you are the ones who survive. Those who want nothing, those who don't play the game, they're the ones who get swept away." Vince's mind spun. He had never considered himself anything more than an ordinary man, but Victor's words made him question everything. Was it possible to remain ordinary in a world that demanded so much? Was he even capable of making such a choice? After what seemed like a lifetime, Vince finally nodded. "I'll accept your offer. But I'm not making any promises beyond that." Victor's smile widened, though there was something almost predatory in his expression. "But that's all I need. Now, you're part of something bigger." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Victor spoke about his empire, about the people who worked for him and the deals that kept his world turning. Vince listened, absorbing every word, though part of him still couldn't quite grasp the full extent of what he had just agreed to. As Vince left the restaurant that night, he felt a strange sense of both relief and unease. He had made his choice, but he wasn't sure what came next. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back now. In the days that followed, Vince's life began to change in ways he couldn't have anticipated. It started slowly, an unexpected visit from one of Victor's men, a phone call, an anonymous gift left at his doorstep. Each small gesture pulled him deeper into Victor's world. But it wasn't until he was called into action that he realized the gravity of his decision. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when Vince received a call from an unmarked number. He hesitated before answering, but when he heard the familiar voice on the other end, his heart sank. "Vince," Victor said, his tone as calm as ever, "I need you to do something for me." Vince's blood ran cold. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he would find out what it really meant to be a part of Victor Ricci's world. "What is it?" Vince asked, trying to sound unaffected, though his hands were trembling. "I need you to meet someone," Victor replied. "A man named John Caruso. He's a problem. I want you to handle it." Vince felt his stomach churn. He didn't know what "handle it" meant, but he had a sinking feeling he wouldn't like it. "Handle it how?" Vince asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Victor's response was simple. "Whatever it takes." And just like that, Vince was thrust into a world of violence, betrayal, and power struggles. His decision to accept Victor's offer had marked the beginning of something much darker than he had imagined. The man who had once been just a security guard was now a player in a dangerous game, and there was no telling how far he would have to go to survive. As Vince prepared for the meeting with John Caruso, he couldn't help but wonder if he had made the right choice. Was he really capable of becoming the man Victor wanted him to be? Was he ready to step into this world, where loyalty and fear were the only currencies that mattered? There was no turning back now. Vince had entered a world where survival meant more than morality, and the choices ahead of him would be unlike anything he had ever faced. The day of the meeting with John Caruso arrived sooner than Vince had anticipated. He woke up to a quiet, tense morning, feeling the weight of the promise he had made to Victor. He had always prided himself on his ability to stay calm in any situation, but today was different. The decision he had made to join Victor Ricci's world was beginning to feel more real, more dangerous. Vince's thoughts raced as he prepared for the meeting. He couldn't help but wonder what it would be like. Who was John Caruso? What kind of problem had he caused? Victor hadn't given him much information beyond the need to handle it. But that vague instruction left too many possibilities open. As Vince drove to the location Victor had given him, his eyes constantly flicked to the rearview mirror. He was hyper-aware of every car around him, knowing that there could be someone watching, waiting. It wasn't paranoia, it was the reality of his new life. The meeting spot was a dimly lit warehouse on the outskirts of Chicago, far from the prying eyes of the city. When Vince arrived, he could feel the chill of the place in the air, the silence hanging thick and heavy. A black SUV was parked at the entrance, its engine still running. Two men in dark suits stood by the vehicle, silent sentinels who didn't acknowledge Vince's arrival. He parked his car and stepped out, trying to keep his posture relaxed. His heart thudded in his chest, but he kept his steps steady as he approached the entrance of the warehouse. The air inside was thick with the scent of oil and metal, a stark contrast to the city's usual hum. The overhead lights flickered, casting long, uneven shadows across the concrete floor. John Caruso was already there. He stood in the center of the room, his back to Vince as he stared out at the empty space. He didn't seem to notice Vince's approach, which only added to the tension in the air. "Mr. Caruso?" Vince called out cautiously. The man turned slowly. Vince noted his age, mid-40s, with hard, sharp features and a cold, calculating expression. His dark eyes narrowed slightly as if sizing Vince up. "You must be the man Victor sent," Caruso said in a low, gravelly voice. His tone wasn't unfriendly, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Vince nodded, trying to maintain his composure. "I'm here to talk." Caruso didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gestured toward a small, battered wooden table at the far end of the warehouse. "Sit," he ordered. "We've got business to discuss." Vince followed him, taking a seat opposite Caruso. The moment he sat down, he realized just how exposed he felt in this space. The walls, the shadows, the emptiness, it all made him feel like a part of something much larger, something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. "I hear you're a man of action," Caruso said, leaning back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "Victor told me you're resourceful, that you've got what it takes." Vince didn't respond immediately. He was trying to gauge the man in front of him. There was something about Caruso's demeanor that felt off, like he was playing a game Vince hadn't learned the rules for yet. "You've got a problem," Vince finally said. "Victor says you need help with it." Caruso's lips curled into a small, humorless smile. "That's right. I've got a little issue with a few people who think they can push me around. People who don't know how to stay in their lane. And I need someone to remind them of that." Vince's stomach tightened. It was becoming clear that Caruso's problem wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was something far more serious. "Who are they?" Vince asked, his voice steady despite the rising anxiety in his chest. Caruso leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Vince's with an intensity that made the air feel even thicker. "A rival faction. They've been trying to muscle in on my operations. They think they can take what's mine. They're wrong. But I need someone who's not afraid to get their hands dirty, someone who can make them see that." Vince's pulse quickened. He knew what this was now. Caruso was asking for a favor, a dangerous favor. This was no simple task. It was about sending a message. A message of power, intimidation, and control. It was the kind of thing that could cost someone their life. Caruso's gaze never wavered as he continued. "You've done something for Victor, now it's time to do something for me. Help me with this and you'll have my support. You'll have everything you need. Don't help and, well, let's just say, you might find yourself on the wrong side of things." Vince felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him again. This was what Victor had warned him about. This was the life he had chosen when he agreed to accept the protection. It wasn't about morals or doing what was right, it was about survival. "I'll do it," Vince said, his voice low but firm. "Tell me what needs to be done." Caruso's lips curled into a satisfied smile. "Good. You'll meet my associates tonight. They'll give you the details. Do exactly what's asked of you, and we won't have any problems." Vince stood up, ready to leave. He could feel the gravity of the situation weighing on him, but he had made his choice. There was no turning back. As he walked toward the door, Caruso's voice stopped him. "Remember, Vince," Caruso called, his tone laced with finality. "In this world, there's no room for hesitation. You make a choice and you stick with it. Don't forget that." Vince didn't respond. He walked out of the warehouse, the cold night air hitting his face like a slap. He had crossed the line. There was no going back now. And the path ahead was one he wasn't sure he was ready for. As Vince drove to the meeting spot for the job, he realized how far he had fallen into this world. What started as a simple act of kindness had led him to this: danger, violence, and the looming shadow of Victor Ricci's empire. He didn't know what would happen after this job, but one thing was certain: his life would never be the same again. The night air was thick with anticipation as Vince made his way to the meeting point, a dimly lit alley in one of the rougher neighborhoods of Chicago. The headlights of his car cast long shadows across the cracked pavement as he parked in front of an old, abandoned warehouse. He could hear the hum of distant traffic, but in this corner of the city, it felt as if the world had been reduced to just him and the dark figures waiting in the shadows. Vince took a deep breath and got out of the car, his mind still racing from the events of the evening. His hands, though steady, felt cold with the weight of what he was about to do. He had made his choice. Now he had to follow through. As he walked toward the warehouse, two men stepped out from the darkness, their expressions unreadable. They were Caruso's associates, the ones who had been sent to guide him through the job. One of them, a large man with a scar running down his cheek, spoke first. "You Vince?" he asked, his voice rough, carrying a dangerous edge. Vince nodded, trying to mask the unease he felt. "Yeah. Let's get this over with." The men led him inside, through a narrow hallway that smelled of mildew and rust. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the walls, each one a reminder of how deep Vince was getting into this world. There was no turning back now. Inside the warehouse, a group of men were gathered around a table, their faces grim. They all turned to look as Vince entered, their eyes appraising him, sizing him up. Caruso's associates explained the plan in cold, precise detail. It wasn't a long explanation, just a simple job, a message to send to the rival faction that had crossed Caruso. Vince was handed a gun, the weight of it unfamiliar in his hand. He had never been in a situation like this before. His stomach churned as the reality of what he was about to do settled in. The job was straightforward: go in, make sure the message was clear, and leave. No one was supposed to get hurt, but Vince knew how these things worked. Violence was inevitable. The target was a small warehouse down the street, where the rival group had been holed up. Vince and the two associates moved swiftly through the night, the sound of their footsteps drowned by the beating of Vince's heart in his ears. The air was thick with tension, and every corner felt like it could be their last. When they reached the rival's warehouse, Vince felt the surge of adrenaline. The men surrounding him were tense, their eyes scanning every movement. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a test. A test of loyalty, a test of courage. And Vince wasn't sure if he was ready to pass. They entered the building through a side door, moving quietly, each step calculated. Vince's mind raced as they approached the room where the rival group was holed up. The plan was simple: intimidate, send a message, and get out. But as Vince stepped closer, the plan started to unravel. A noise from the other room, then shouts, followed by gunfire. Chaos erupted in an instant. Vince's heart leaped into his throat as he instinctively ducked behind a stack of crates. The gunfire was deafening, and he could hear the shouting growing louder. He knew this was no longer a simple warning. It was a full-blown confrontation. In the midst of the chaos, Vince saw the men he had come with, Caruso's associates, open fire. He froze, not knowing what to do. He wasn't ready for this. The violence, the bloodshed, it was all too much. And then, just as quickly as it started, it ended. The rival group had scattered, and the building fell eerily silent. Vince's hands trembled as he looked around at the aftermath. The ground was littered with debris, and a few men from the rival faction lay motionless on the floor. Vince felt a wave of nausea hit him. He had never wanted to be part of something like this. The job had seemed simple, but now, standing in the middle of it all, the reality of what he had become a part of hit him like a ton of bricks. As he turned to leave, one of the associates caught his eye. "You did good," the man said gruffly. "Now, you understand what it takes." Vince said nothing, his mind reeling. What had he done? What had he become? There was no turning back from this. He had crossed a line, and now, there was no way to erase the consequences. As Vince returned to his apartment that night, his body felt heavy, like it was carrying the weight of everything he had just witnessed. He had taken the first step into Victor Ricci's world, a world where power, fear, and loyalty dictated everything. He looked at the gun on the table, his reflection in the cold metal staring back at him. He had made his choice. But now, he wondered if he had made a mistake. Could he live with this? Could he live with the man he was becoming? The world he had entered was dangerous, unpredictable, and brutal. But it was also the world he had chosen. There was no going back. The question now wasn't whether he could escape, it was whether he could survive. Vince sat down on his couch, his mind a whirlpool of thoughts. But one thing was certain, the game had only just begun. And there was no way out. The path he had chosen would lead him further into the heart of darkness. The choices he made next would determine who he truly was. Would he remain a man of honor, or would he become just another player in a world where morality had no place? Only time would tell.